Hey there, Pythonistas. So I'm talking to people learning Python, but also if you're a teacher of Python, you're an instructor, maybe not just Python, you teach quite a few languages, you're always looking for tips and, you know, ideas. So I'm sharing ideas to other instructors as well. This one involves the context manager construct and using it as a way of getting in touch with a database. I'm just talking about it could be a NoSQL or like not an SQL database, but in this case it is. I've got a UFOs database, reports, sightings. I believe it's like real data collected over the years, some thousands of reports, and you can get it over the internet from this bit.ly address. So in a context of a class, I would just cut and paste this URL to the chat window. My students are in real time but not present. We're not present to each other. There's no room where they're at either. They're all in their own personal workspace. And that's one of many configurations. I've taught other configurations. And so we're going to use these internet reports in two different ways. Both times we're going to well, in this example, we're going to create the database from scratch. We're actually going to replace it if it exists, and we're using the very capable data frame type from the Pandas library or framework, which has its own built-in SQL creating capability if you send it a schema. Now, that's pretty fancy. It works with SQLite though. And so I create this and then I go ahead and select data back from it. So let's just run that whole thing. So that just defines the function. All the code you're looking at in this cell says, I'll do this if you ever call me, but you haven't called me yet. It's like what I will do if I am pushed to act. But we haven't asked for any action yet. Once we do, it's going to actually try to do all this stuff. And so I better have a path like this available. This is like talking to some basement steps and a whole floor structure in the data files or in the data tree, in the file tree. So I better be set up for all that. I'm not saying if my students have downloaded the directories and unzipped them, they would have that structure already. It's not uncommon for the student folder to have some structure. So it does work. It does pull back the data. It gives me roughly a sense of how many of each shape of UFO have been seen. If I'd like to know like if I comment this out, I get the head, but this just shows me the shape of the data. It's almost 20,000 records, 5 columns across. So there was no use of a context manager so far in any of this code. I'm just showing you a more standard, straightforward, actually very streamlined way using the Pandas data frame to make all this stuff happen. Actually, here I'm using the native SQLite 3 library, which I renamed to SQL from SQLite 3. That's what it's called. Import SQLite 3 as SQL. So in this next cell, what I'm saying is when I do SQL make a connection, I'm using the SQLite database that comes, SQLite module that comes with the Python standard library. Now I'm going to do that in Spider as well, so I'm switching away from Jupyter Notebooks into my interactive development environment, which is much the same in terms of this code is designed to work in the test area where I have if name equals dunder main. This is a standard in Python to say, hey, if you run me top level, me being the module, then do this code here. Otherwise, if you just import me, ignore what's highlighted. So I'm going to run this top level by hitting the green arrow, and it's actually going to use what's now a more streamlined approach to connecting to the database. And I can use this with multiple SQLite databases, right? I just pass in the name at the time of instantiation. Instantiation in the with clause, the with statement, is happening right where I call the type with its argument. So in this case, a path to the database. That's my one argument to init, the DB, and that just gets stored as DB name. But what happens right after that? without pause, it goes ahead and runs the dunder enter. This is just what we know to do if we're Python and the keyword with is being used. And whatever dunder enter returns, that's going to be as DB. So in this case, I return self. And this is a standard thing to return, often done, an instance of the context manager itself, and especially useful when you pack it out with a lot more methods designed specifically to work with the database. And I do this in other examples, like when I'm working with a user password database. All the fetch one, authenticate, add one, everything I need to do with that database, I can put it in here. And I may want to be more less generic in that case. I may just want to talk about that particular database. And so in that case, I'm not going to be so open-ended as to which database we're talking about. A lot depends on context, as you know. So here, going back to, say, the user CRUD, this is creating, retrieving, updating, deleting is why I keep saying CRUD there. I am using DB class, the same one we just looked at, exactly the same one, inside each of these functions for checking the tables, fetching all the tables, and so on. I could go out and run this, but I think instead I'll just summarize and say, you know, when you are teaching the context manager type, a very good use for it that I highly recommend and have tested a lot, and I think it works well, is to do as follows. Show them how you can use a with statement to connect to a database as you go in, and then of course as you work with data, things can go wrong. And what the dunder exit method is tasked with is dealing with anything that needs any loose ends, you could say. So those will come in, always there'll be 3 arguments, which I gather up using the gather operator into a single tuple called oops, because that's the error exception type stuff. And if I have a connection, I'll close it, and then I'll check, you know, if there's anything going on with oops, I can kick that on to be dealt with higher up, in which case I return false, or I can put all the handling code right here. If I return true, then it's considered to be handled and there's no further exception to deal with in terms of exiting the context. So you can play with that. There's more to be said about it. It's more like you're wondering where to use context managers in your curriculum. I'm suggesting with simple databases, it can be just flat files like I'm using with UFOs, roller coasters. They're not complex databases and the queries are not complex. And I don't know any good way to teach Python without occasionally coming up against these neighboring, I'll call them neighboring over the back fence technologies or other ecosystems like SQL, regular expressions, the bash shell. The Jupyter notebooks themselves are a third-party technology. So you don't teach just pure core Python, you expand it out to where it's meeting up with its neighboring, its closest friends, you could say. All right, talk to you soon.